Audience. Okay. Good evening. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. I'll be tonight's host. With us we have Dan Carter, who's a state representative from the district which includes part of Bethel, part of Reading, and part of Danbury. Dan, first of all, tell the audience who you are, where you came from, and what brought you to where you are today.
Well, it's a long story. Well, first off, let me say thank you for letting me be on your show.
My pleasure. Glad to have you.
I know we've been trying to get together and do this for a while, so I'm really happy to be here.
Excellent.
So a little bit about me. I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Ohio, and grew up just north of Dayton, Ohio. Went to school at a state school, Bowling Green. And upon graduation, I joined the Air Force. Went to the Air Force for 10 years. I was a C-130 pilot starting out.
Is that a transport?
It's a transport.
Okay.
We were our job was what we called tactical airlift. So my job was to get either troopers, beans, bullets, whatever it was, to where our user needed it, whether it be on combat or in the Caribbean. It didn't matter to me.
Was that always in a more peaceful setting, or did you ever fly into a tough situation?
Sure, did both.
Okay.
Most of my combat time actually was in Bosnia. It was during the humanitarian relief in Bosnia.
That was right in the middle of it. Wow.
Yeah, so I was there. I was actually there for Provide Promise, which was our first part of involvement in Bosnia in the early 90s.
Yeah.
We were resupplying Sarajevo, so I had a few of those sorties under my belt. And then we did a nighttime humanitarian relief mission. I was flying with the United Nations crews, German and French crews.
Yeah.
And we would go in at nighttime over besieged Bosnia, and we would drop food to United Nations safe zones, where they would get all the refugees together to protect them. And we'd come in from high altitude at night and bring seeds, food, whatever we could think of. So it was really a unique opportunity to do something that was bigger than me.
It was a great humanitarian effort.
It was a lot of fun.
And proof of the pudding is today where those countries have returned to a sense of normalcy.
It is, and it was an honor to be part of that. In fact, a unique experience. I'll just throw this out.
Yeah.
I went to the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, about 2 months ago with my kids, and at the museum they actually have a Provide Promise display. So it was really neat to see exactly what we were doing through that period of time.
Kids, that was me.
That was me. Pictures of our aircraft, what we were doing. So it was really it was a fun experience. And then I went on. I taught pilot training for about 5 years, and then moved to Connecticut. I was married, and my wife was from Connecticut, so moved up to Reading about 13 years ago.
Yep.
And I was in Reading for about 6 years, involved in the community some. I was in the Parks and Rec Commission, and for my day job, I was working for a healthcare company, and then moved to Bethel 7 years ago.
Yep.
And the rest is history. I've been in Bethel for about 7 years, and I got the notion, about 3 years ago that I want to become more involved, and now here I am. I'm at the table,
Alrighty.
trying to do a good job.
Okay, now both you and I have a little bit of a libertarian bent. I wouldn't call either one of us a true libertarian, but I've had some great local libertarians on the show, including Billy Michael, Kyle Scheich, also a young man who's a libertarian who was very much enamored of the work of Ron Paul. And when I had Billy on, Billy and I came to the conclusion that libertarians and progressives have a lot in common in the sense that where libertarians believe in smaller government, progressives believe in more efficient government, and I think we found a lot of good common ground on that. And it was a great awakening for me in the sense that the show from there became a show where no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you look for common ground and then problem solve from there. But let's look a little bit in terms of the recent storm that we had, not Irene, well maybe Irene too, but also the gale, the snowstorm we had. We had some big issues, some big problems to tackle in terms of downed trees, consequently down power lines, consequently loss of power over really virtually the entire area. Give us an overview about how that played out over that 7, 8, 9, 10 days in the most recent storm. How did that play out?
Well, I mean, it's It's pretty big. I mean, you got to look at number one, that the second storm came on the heels of the first. The first was pretty much a record.
Yeah.
Irene was 830,000 customers without power, and then it was about 20,000 more, 850,000 with the snowstorm.
Yeah.
So looking up to the snowstorm, I think obviously, and I've said this publicly, we kind of got caught with our pants down, so to speak. I don't think anybody realized the level of storm that was approaching us. I've noticed, in the Northeast, sometimes those nor'easters are a little more difficult to predict.
Yeah.
Earlier Friday morning, I was hearing a dusting. I was pretty excited about the first snow in the season.
You mentioned having been a pilot. You watched the weather channel,
I do.
Weather maps very carefully.
I do, and it was interesting. It wasn't until late Friday, more like late Friday night, where people started talking about the possibilities of what would happen over the weekend. And obviously, if you're trying to muster up the support in CLP and get people ready to go, it was already too late. I mean, even for Irene, they knew that was coming.
Right.
And they had done a pretty significant preparation for the week prior. Now that we can address whether it was effective or not, because obviously there's a lot of room for improvement. But with the second snowstorm, I think it was a pretty unique experience because, number one, nobody was really ready. None of what had been discovered coming out of Irene had been put in practice. And to make matters worse, you could say that this has been an ongoing thing in Connecticut for a number of decades. Back as early as '85, and with Gloria and a couple of the nor'easters,
we had an ice storm back in I'm going to say 1982 on Columbus Day, where we had a very similar situation to what we had with this snowstorm, where we had ice and we had trees that had a lot of leaves left on them, but it was Columbus Day.
Right.
And I remember I at the time I lived on Highland Avenue in Bethel, and we had bought Meg Ryan's dad's house, who bought it from the Carluzzi's, from Bobby Carluzzi. Matter of fact, one of the trees in the yard had been named Bobby. And I woke up at 3 o'clock that morning, Columbus Day, and to the sound of what sounded like shotgun fire, just racket outside like you wouldn't believe. And obviously what had happened was we had an ice storm, and the ice and snow had accumulated on branches of trees, and the tree branches under the weight branches were cracking and falling off everywhere and causing what ended up being a very long power outage then. Now, I ran outside because I had two red maples in the front yard. The maples with the really fine leaves.
Right.
And shook the ice and the snow off those leaves, and thankfully both those trees survived. Now, Bobby did not, unfortunately. Sorry, Bobby. But I remember it as being a terrific event back then.
Right.
But that was Columbus Day. This year, it was just about Halloween, and yet we had leaves on the trees like I've never seen in 58 years, leaves on the trees this late in the year. And as you well noted before we came on, there's a lot of trees out there today that still have a lot of leaves on them.
And I think the other part of it, too, was the nature of the storm, the snow, how wet and how heavy the snow was. I think most of us looked at that, and it was a very strange snow. And in volume. I mean, it was like the perfect storm, so to speak.
Yeah, I was out the next morning taking pictures that ended up on the Patch article and right at sunrise. And it was just a very eerie landscape. And we had lost, up in Plumtree Heights, we had lost quite a bit of large branches off trees. Branches at the top of the trees had broken off and were hanging down. Of course, all the power is underground there.
Right.
But when you have power substations going out all over the area, that doesn't do you much good when you've got lines underground in a neighborhood.
Right, right. Well, I mean, obviously, this is going to be the dilemma we face from here on. I've been one of those politicians where I've kind of reserved what I've said through the second snowstorm, especially, because I don't think it's productive to go out and just yell heads will roll.
Yeah.
At this point, we need real, meaningful change and reform in the way we do things. And I think whatever we do is going to focus on, number one, prevention. Yeah. We have to start looking at the way we manage trees. And I don't believe clear cutting, because currently what happens is if that tree is within 10 feet of the line, it's pretty much fair game by CLP.
Yeah.
And they'll go out and they'll cut it. But I think what we're finding is that there are a lot of large, older trees which are on the private property.
Yeah.
And those customers are notified and often don't want to cut the tree, or the town doesn't want them to cut the tree. And now we're in this dilemma because this has been going on for a long time. If we don't manage that tree population reasonably. Because the one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to change the culture of what Connecticut is.
Right, which is a treed state.
It's a treed state. We like that.
In fact, more trees here. You'd have to go back before the settlers arrived to find more trees in the state of Connecticut. It's just amazing that all the farmland, as farms have gone out of business and land's gone from being farmland to being suburban land, and you have more trees in Connecticut now than you did before, until you have to go back before the settlers arrived. But at any rate, how does that impact what Connecticut Light and Power did? Where do you see any obvious changes that they can make?
Well, I mean, I think obviously, I had the sense that with responding to the different outages and the different situations, each line that was down, each item, I think they treat each one like they would on a normal storm or a normal outage. What I would envision is a better response effort that would include getting more local tree crews trained to be able to remove the trees from the power lines and be sooner, because those tree crews are here. Yeah. They're right here in our backyard. They're in our state. Yeah. So I think if we can have the CLMP go out more quickly and identify where they can turn off the grid, and let these tree crews do their job more quickly, then by the time the actual power crews get here, then we have the opportunity to get those lines fixed much more quickly. The other part of it that always comes up every year is communication in the town. For being able to communicate where the lines are down and what's happening. I noticed in Reading, one of the things that they did really well is they actually had an officer with each of those beginning crews. They had one crew out there dedicated to opening roads, and they had one crew out there dedicated to getting trees, out of power lines and getting the important things turned on.
So you had the same officers, the same cadre of officers involved in the same process on a daily basis, so they kind of knew what they were doing secondhand. After
you could say a lot of the officers know those crews, but for a communication effort, those officers were there. They were able to feed back to the headquarters what was going on. So I think from that standpoint, they were at a little bit of an advantage.
So a little bit more efficient operation.
Right. Now that, I don't know that you could do that in Danbury, for instance. But there has to be a better way at this point to maintain better communication with those crews. And for CLMP to be able to feed back the information to our civic leaders so they're able to communicate with the public. And that was a real breakdown. Yeah,
and I think really all in all, with the last two storms, I think that the concept that we've gotten into of the first selectmen or mayors in the individual towns getting the word out via phone, via automated communication to citizens 2, 3, 4 times a day is really helpful, because it keeps maybe keeps people a little too much attuned to what's going on and thinking a little bit too much about what they should be complaining about and how come my neighborhood's out. But it does give them a lot of good information in terms of the progress. I mean, if people were completely in the dark, no pun intended, during the storm, for days and days and days, and had no idea when they could ever expect to get power back, I think tempers would have flared probably a lot more than they really did.
Yeah, and they were pretty flared. But I want to bring up something that's interesting, though. This is one of the first major disasters like this where a lot of people don't have home phones now. We're in the day of cellular phone. And that too provides a unique wrinkle to what's going on. Is how do we get that word out to the folks who have cell phones as their primary home line?
There you go, right here. This is the phone line in my household.
Right. I think in Reading there was at some places there's a setup where you can get emergency messages passed to your cell, but the majority of folks don't understand that that's even available. So it creates a new wrinkle for our city executives to be able to get that information out. And of course the other rub with this compared to Irene was it was cold. Yeah. And we really had to make sure that the elderly had somewhere to go, or those who which, by the way,
municipal centers and all the towns were set up nicely.
Amazing job. I had gone and visited most of the shelters routinely at night. I don't particularly go for the photo ops so much. I like to go at night. It was quiet. I could actually talk to the people, talk to the Red Cross. Gather
good information rather than, as you say, do the photo ops.
And for me, it was interesting because while I was in the military, one of the things I did was safety. I was heavily involved in safety and mobility and strategic planning for disasters. So I actually had written a hurricane evacuation plan in my career, so for me, I had an interesting perspective to learn about, with the Red Cross and how things worked. How, for instance, partnership shelters worked besides the shelters they took over. I learned a lot, and I got to tell you, our city executives, parties aside, they all did a really nice job. I mean, they really worked hard. We had a lot of people come out and volunteer.
And that was reflected at the polls, it appeared.
I think so. It's interesting because looking at the incumbent advantage, I would almost want to go and look to the towns that were hardest hit and see if more of those towns stayed incumbent. Because looking at the parties, there was a net gain by the Republicans in the state, in the smaller towns. But I don't know where that would have been. I think that at least in our area where the snowstorm really hit us, that had to be a huge advantage for those because it gave them a chance to do their job. Yeah. It gave them a chance to be a leader.
But it also gave them a chance to mess up.
That's true. That's true.
So the proof is in the pudding there, and if they had not done a good job, then it probably would have reflected adversely at the polls.
Right. Well, and I think something we saw, Irene compared to the snowstorm. Number one, on Irene, our city executives had an opportunity to get a little under their belt and see, what worked and what didn't. It was a trial period. And the second thing in the snowstorm, I don't think as many people went after the city executives as much as CL&P. I think that in a way, people knew it was going to be longer, but anything that they had problems with, they went directly after CL&P. And the city officials, I think, got a little more pass on that because it really wasn't their fault. They did what they could to get the shelters up and running. And
theirs was a more reactive kind of situation where CL&P was called upon to be proactive. And I think people will generally agree that there was some element of failure there, if not a huge element of failure. But again, maybe it's a learning experience for them for next time. And you mentioned about the idea about preparatory work. And now trees, most streets, if the audience doesn't know, most streets have at least a 10-foot buffer. Your property goes only to 10 feet to the curb. And that last 10 feet is an easement so that utility companies, so people can get in there and do whatever work's necessary. If they need to put wires underneath, if they need to do anything, they have that 10-foot easement to do that. Now, if there are trees within that 10-foot easement, they're fair game.
Yeah. Oh, then the way I understand it, if the tree itself is within 10 foot of the power line, the branch, whatever, that's
They've
fair
got
game
that latitude too.
Right. And I think that would often happen. I heard that more in Irene, where there'd be a tree just outside of the 10-foot line, and they couldn't touch it. We had to wait for either the property owner or somebody else, or DOT in some instances, to come out and take care of it.
And yet the branches, although the tree trunk is more than 10 feet from the power line, certainly the branches are extended over or sometimes even into the power lines.
Right. And listen, I think you had mentioned something about how the tops of trees and the larger branches. I mean, this was significant. So, I mean, the bottom line is we have to look for a way to make it so that property owners and the towns won't keep this from happening, and that people understand we're not going to go clear cut things. I mean, this can't be go overboard. It has to be a reasonable response. That's where the libertarian part, I think, kind of comes in.
Stay away from my trees. They're on my property. Don't touch my trees. Well, as you're alluding to, if their branches on their trees can cause a power outage for literally 1,000 homes, then maybe they have to sacrifice a little bit of their tree, a branch or two, in order to make sure that we won't have that 1,000.
It becomes a major public safety issue. We can't afford to have elderly folks trapped in their home, during the wintertime just because somebody wants a tree.
I'm trying to think of an analogy because there's an old saw about the right of your fist ends where my nose begins. So in other words, you can do whatever you want to, as long as it doesn't impact another human being.
It's interesting you said that earlier, talking about libertarian views and progressive views. I'll hear sometimes people will criticize libertarianism, saying it's too far left. But you know what?
Yeah.
There are a lot of conservatives who have very strong libertarian views. It's like the one common ground sometimes where we can operate
across political lines to a great degree. Because I think this is what we are as Americans, and sometimes it's to our betterment and sometimes it's to our detriment. The notion of that self-determination, because sometimes that self-determination does get in the way of the common good.
Well, and that's where we all always have our battles, is how far where that line is. That's
States' rights versus federal responsibility. We've been fighting that since the Civil War.
I mean, listen, they were fighting that when they wrote the Constitution.
Absolutely.
I mean, that was the whole point.
Yep.
When the Constitution was what they finally agreed on, because it was a bitter, drawn-out fight,
we're
going to be fighting it forever. Because, listen, I almost believe that there's always two sides to everything. We know that. Right, left, yin, yang, whatever, top, bottom.
Yep.
When it comes to behavior, there's always two sides, and there's everywhere that's gray in between. In this case, there's always going to be the folks who are really worried about trusting government, because they think it's dangerous. It's going to be take too much from us, and there will be those who don't trust not having a government, or they don't trust each other, and they think that the corporations are going to. There's always going to be that, and the question is, where can we work in the middle to get these things done?
And along with libertarianism, you have the notion of anarchism, and I always fancy myself as being a great anarchist because I feel like would be well behaved enough, so that if there were no police and were no government and were no laws, I would conduct myself personally in a way, partly because of my religious convictions. I would act my conscience and would be a good person.
Right.
But I guess some of us need a little more backing from somebody telling them what to do and pushing them in the right direction.
Well, I think everybody, a lot of people agree that there's a role for government as a referee sometimes to step in and keep things reasonable. But I think even our forefathers realized that there was a limit to how much power that you wanted over you.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Because it always was interesting to me, because I never understood why somebody will look at a government, and say, well, I'll trust that politician versus I won't trust the corporate CEO. It's interesting because you're still deciding what person you're going to put a trust in.
Yeah.
And then you could make the argument that the CEO is going to be corrupted by money, and the politician is corrupted by power. Yeah. Maybe money, as we've heard recently with Congress.
Nowadays, with that Supreme Court decision, which pretty much gave unfettered campaign financing to these PACs.
Well, but you also got to understand, it gave unfettered campaign financing to everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, listen,
and it's bad for everybody.
I'm a big believer in campaign finance reform. I would love to see all that drawn out.
Corporations, unions, I'm sure you'll get that into that. Yep.
Individuals only.
Yep. That's 100% agreement with you right there.
I think that would make a lot of sense to me, that you set up certain limits to what you could do per election.
Okay, we're going to have to break off right there, because I believe we've run our course for this show. We're going to take a break, and we might even come back and do a second show through the miracle of modern television. This has been Progressive Soup. I'm David Stevenson. Dan Carter, representatives from 2nd District, Bethel, portion of Bethel, portion of Reading, and portion of Danbury. Thanks. Good night. Now that's going to fade out, and we have to, pretend like we're talking.
I always love that part at the end, though.
I did not set my phone out. That's why I'm not exactly sure. I think
how long it went?
I think we went about 27 minutes.
Okay.
I think we started about quarter after, and the problem is, if it's more than 28 minutes, I'm going to have to go back and I'm going to have to shred something out, which I don't want to, because the conversation went so smoothly, and so.
Officer Jay Morchera from Danbury Police Department, Community Affairs Division. Talk a little bit today about the Child Passenger Safety Program. We do inspections on Mondays, 3 Mondays a month from 8 a.m. till 2 p.m. And basically what we do in a nutshell is we check the child restraint to make sure that there's no defects, check it under the National Recall List, and we'll do a visual inspection, make sure all the components are correct and there, and then we will make sure that the car seat is installed properly.
All right, so we're going to push in toward the back of the seat. Okay, we're just going to run the seatbelt through. Still want to switch this over. You don't want to pull all the way out and switch it over, retract over. Okay, just lock it in. I'm still pushing in toward the back of the seat. Push down. Take all the slack out. There's a lock off over here on the other side. You had it through both of them?
Yeah.
Just going to go through the one opposite the buckle over here. Okay. That bypasses the shoulder portion of the lap belt so it doesn't tip it up. Okay. You want to check it here. You want the seat to move less than each side to side. And you can see that the whole car's moving. Okay, so that's in there tight.
Okay, do you want to mark that?
Yeah, you have a marker?
Seatbelt?
Yeah.
So he knows where it's got to be.
I'm going to mark the seatbelt here. Okay. So you'll know if you have to take this out where you have to get it to in order for it to be tight. Okay. This is a level indicator here. So you can see you want the bubble to be in between the lines here to make sure you have the appropriate reading. Okay. So pop the carrier in. Just make sure when you pop this in, here, click like that.
Hi, welcome to Community Access Channel 23. Let's go on inside and see what's going on.
Dream big.
Hey, this is Big T here telling you to dream big.
Hey, at Channel 23, you can dream big and direct your own show.
Dream big.
We want you to all dream big.
We
Dream big.
Cable Access, Channel 23, dream big.
Call us today at 203-792-1265 and find out how you can dream big at Channel 23.